Number 1. Afeni Badu Muhammad. She was 26 years old, known at work for her quiet intensity and unpredictable moods. Her name was Afeni Badu Muhammad, a McDonald's employee in East Point, Michigan. On a July morning in 2025, what began as a routine work shift spiraled into one of the most shocking acts of workplace violence in recent memory: the killing of her manager, Jennifer Harris, a 39-year-old mother of 6 who had spent more than 15 years at the same restaurant. That morning, the tension between the two women came to a head. According to prosecutors, Harris had sent Muhammad home early after a disagreement. Witnesses later said the exchange wasn't loud or dramatic, just the kind of managerial decision that happens every day in fast food kitchens. But when Muhammad walked out of the building, she didn't leave the conflict behind. Investigators say she went home, armed herself with a knife, and prepared to return. A short time later, she drove back to the McDonald's. Security footage and witness accounts show that she arrived wearing a mask and used the employee entrance, a deliberate route that suggested planning rather than impulse. Inside, the morning crew was still working, unaware of the danger moving toward them. Prosecutors allege that Muhammad walked straight to the back, found her manager, and attacked. Harris was stabbed multiple times before she could escape. Some reports from the arraignment mention as many as 15 stab wounds, though the precise number remains an allegation until trial. Panic erupted inside the restaurant. Customers screamed, workers ran for cover, and outside in the drive-thru, one legally armed customer realized what was happening. He stepped from his vehicle, fired a single shot to stop the assault, and then chased the attacker to the parking lot. There, with the weapon still in hand, he ordered Muhammad to the ground and held her at gunpoint until police arrived. No one else was injured in that exchange. Paramedics rushed Jennifer Harris to a nearby hospital, but the injuries were catastrophic. She died shortly afterward, leaving behind 6 children and a devastated community. For colleagues, her death felt impossible. A trusted manager murdered inside the same restaurant she had devoted half her life to running. Police arrested Afeni Badu Muhammad at the scene without resistance. Prosecutors later revealed that she had a prior record, a 2022 conviction in Alexandria, Virginia, for unlawful wounding after stabbing a former boyfriend. The conviction, which carried a 4-year suspended sentence, became the basis for a habitual offender enhancement in Michigan. Investigators also recovered the knife used in the attack, described as a kitchen blade longer than 3 inches. At her arraignment in East Point's 38th District Court on July 11, 2025, the charges were read aloud: first-degree premeditated murder and carrying a dangerous weapon with unlawful intent. Bond was set at $25 million, cash or surety. Prosecutors called the act calculated, pointing to the mask, the re-entry through the employee door, and the prior argument that morning. The defense entered a plea of not guilty on Muhammad's behalf. As the case moved through the courts, it drew attention across Michigan. In early October, a forensic evaluation at the state's Center for Forensic Psychiatry determined that Muhammad was competent to stand trial. A preliminary examination was scheduled for mid-November. No verdict has yet been reached, and under Michigan law, a conviction for first-degree murder would carry a mandatory life sentence without parole. For the Harris family, the focus has been on remembrance rather than courtroom updates. Friends described Jennifer as hardworking, steady, and devoted to her children, the kind of manager who knew every worker's first name and often filled in when others called off. The East Point McDonald's closed for several days after the killing, its parking lot covered in flowers and handwritten notes from former employees and customers who simply wanted to say goodbye. The tragedy also reignited conversations about workplace safety, background checks, and early warning signs of violent behavior. Prosecutors emphasized that Muhammad's prior conviction, though out of state, showed a troubling pattern. Yet colleagues said she had never displayed open aggression at work before that day. Reports differ on how heated the morning dispute actually was, and the investigation has not found any specific trigger beyond that brief argument. As the case awaits trial, one fact remains beyond dispute. A manager lost her life inside a place meant for everyday routines: coffee, breakfast, and laughter from customers who never imagined danger behind the counter. In a single morning, an ordinary workplace became a crime scene, and 2 lives, one ended, one irreparably changed, entered the record of Michigan's most disturbing employer-employee crimes. Number 2. Montavious Wright. He was 26 years old, quiet, precise, and outwardly ordinary, an office worker who spent his days behind a desk at a Houston technology firm. His name was Montavious Terrell Wright, and in March of 2022, he would turn an ordinary Wednesday morning at 20 Greenway Plaza into a scene of sudden, irreversible violence. The man he killed was his supervisor, Doran Kelly, a respected 48-year-old team leader at Cedar Gate Technologies, where he had worked for roughly 7 years. What began as a normal workday in a glass and steel office tower ended with Kelly lying dead on the 10th floor, a single bullet wound to the head, and his employee in handcuffs just hours later. That morning, the hum of keyboards and quiet conversation filled the company's open workspace. At about 11 a.m., according to police reports, Wright arrived for work as usual. No one noticed anything unusual about him. He carried a small bag and walked straight to the 10th floor suite. Moments later, witnesses heard a sharp crack echo down the hallway. Just one gunshot. Several employees ducked under desks or ran for the elevators. When officers entered minutes later, they found Doran Kelly collapsed near his workstation, fatally shot. The suspect was gone. Investigators quickly determined this was not a random attack. Detectives interviewed witnesses who said Wright had gone directly to Kelly's office and past others without confrontation. Houston Police Chief Troy Finner would later tell reporters that the evidence suggested the supervisor was specifically targeted. Patrol units sealed off Greenway Plaza while SWAT teams cleared each floor, but by the time the building was secure, the shooter had already fled. Police traced his vehicle to an apartment complex roughly 10 minutes away. Officers from the homicide division surrounded the area that same afternoon. Video from a bystander's phone shows Wright stepping from his car with his hands raised as officers move in. He was taken into custody without resistance. Inside his apartment, investigators recovered a handgun consistent with the weapon used in the office shooting. That evening, the Houston Police Department released an official bulletin naming Montavious Terrell Wright, age 26, as the suspect charged with murder in the death of Doran Kelly. In court the next day, prosecutors described the attack as deliberate. Wright appeared before a magistrate judge who set bond at $500,000. Within days, the amount was later reduced to $250,000 after argument from his defense counsel, and the case was assigned to the 337th District Court of Harris County. No plea has been entered publicly. Reporters covering the hearing noted that he spoke little and kept his eyes down as the judge read the charge. For Kelly's family, the details were unbearable. He was remembered as a meticulous supervisor who cared about his team, someone who mentored younger analysts and was described by colleagues as patient and principled. Friends gathered outside the Greenway complex to lay flowers and recall how he often stayed late to help employees meet deadlines. There was no record of violent incidents between him and Wright, though investigators confirmed the two worked in the same department and that Kelly was Wright's direct superior. The motive for the shooting remains sealed in the case file, and police have not publicly confirmed any disciplinary issues or disputes between them. The legal proceedings have stretched on for years. In late 2023, while being held in the Harris County Jail, Wright was charged with felony escape after allegedly attempting to walk away from the Joint Processing Center. He was quickly apprehended, and that additional count remains pending along with the murder charge. As of October 2025, no conviction or sentencing has been entered, and the murder trial is still awaiting scheduling in district court. The case struck a chord across Houston because it shattered the illusion of safety inside professional workplaces. The setting was not a high-risk environment, but an ordinary office suite, spreadsheets on screens, coffee cups on desks, the last place anyone expected violence. Police and company officials later emphasized that the attack was over within seconds, offering little chance for intervention. It was quick, targeted, and tragic, one detective said in a press briefing. Reports differ on whether any warning signs were visible before that morning, but every verified account agrees that Kelly was unarmed and unaware of the danger until the fatal moment. In the months since, Cedar Gate Technologies has tightened building security, requiring ID verification and remote door monitoring for every visitor and employee. For those who worked alongside both men, The memories of that day remain vivid. The echo of a single shot, the confusion in the stairwell, the sight of emergency lights flashing against glass walls. Montavious Wright's story now sits in the slow churn of the justice system, one of Houston's most disturbing examples of workplace homicide, a young employee accused of turning on the supervisor who guided his career. The investigation left behind no note, no manifesto, only the physical evidence and a lingering question of why. When the trial eventually begins, prosecutors are expected to argue premeditation, while the defense may point to personal or psychological stress. But for the victim's family, none of it can undo the moment that ended Doran Kelly's life. Number 3. Jeremy Spicer. Nikola Misevic was 30 years old, a young business owner chasing his version of the American dream. Known to friends as Nikola, managed a small trucking and freight company called Winners Freight in Burr Ridge, Illinois, just outside Chicago. Colleagues described him as ambitious and disciplined, a man who started small but built a company with a handful of loyal drivers and office staff. For him, every day was a step toward stability. But on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in March 2022, the ordinary rhythm of paperwork and dispatch calls was broken by a single gunshot that ended his life. That day, March 22nd, began like any other at the Meadowbrook Office Center, a glass-front complex along South Frontage Road. Misevic arrived before lunch, reviewed route schedules, and met briefly with a new employee named Jeremy Jerome Spicer, a 31-year-old truck driver from Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Spicer had joined the company barely a week earlier. According to police, he was struggling to meet expectations, and management had planned to let him go. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, Misevic was sitting inside the office when Spicer walked in carrying a handgun. Witnesses later told investigators that there was no loud argument, no warning. Within seconds, Spicer raised the weapon and fired multiple times, striking his supervisor at close range. Co-workers ducked behind desks and dialed 911 as the gunfire echoed through the office park. Officers and paramedics reached the scene within minutes, finding Misevic critically wounded. He was rushed to Advent Health Hinsdale Hospital, where he was pronounced dead a short time later. But the violence did not stop there. After shooting his boss, Spicer left Winners Freight and drove to another logistics firm nearby, a company where he had previously worked. There, he entered the office and shot a 31-year-old female accountant, hitting her several times before fleeing again. Miraculously, she survived and was later listed in stable condition. From there, Spicer continued on foot, or by car, to a third business called Exit Logistics, asking to see the manager. Employees told him the person he sought was not in. He turned away and left without firing. It was clear to detectives reconstructing the events that his attacks were not random. He appeared to be moving through former workplaces, targeting people connected to his short employment history. By now, police departments from multiple suburbs had converged on the Burr Ridge area. Roads were closed, helicopters circled overhead, and tactical teams searched every suite inside the office complex. Witness statements and surveillance footage helped officers track Spicer's route. About an hour after the first shooting, they found him near another business location, roughly a mile away. As officers approached, he turned the gun on himself and fired a fatal shot. The entire sequence, from the killing of his supervisor to his own suicide, had unfolded in less than 2 hours. Detectives recovered the handgun at the scene and traced it to Spicer. Background checks showed he had a prior misdemeanor record, including a domestic battery conviction in Arkansas, but no outstanding warrants. Investigators concluded that the immediate trigger was a workplace dispute. Spicer had been told he was about to be fired after only a week on the job. Police Chief John Madden later described the motive as a grievance against his employer, a classic case of workplace violence that escalated far beyond what anyone expected. For the Burr Ridge community, the news was shocking. The victims and the shooter had no connection outside of work. There were no warning signs of a planned attack. Within days, friends of Nikola Misevic organized a memorial outside the office complex. They remembered him as a hardworking son, brother, and colleague whose success came from persistence and kindness. A small sea of flowers and candles lined the glass doorway where he had last stood. In the weeks that followed, authorities pieced together the timeline and released a detailed report confirming that no one else was involved. Spicer's death closed the criminal case, but not the wounds left behind. The surviving woman eventually recovered from her injuries, For Misevic's family, though, the loss was permanent, a life taken not by chance, but by an employee's anger on an ordinary workday. Number 4. Jinghua Wu. It was a quiet Friday afternoon inside the glass-walled offices of Seaport Incorporated, a small semiconductor firm tucked into an office park in Santa Clara, California. Just after 3 o'clock, the usual hum of keyboards and muted conversation filled the workspace. Executives were meeting in a conference room. Chief Executive Officer Sid Agrawal, Vice President of Operations Brian Pugh, and Human Resources Manager Marilyn Lewis. They were finalizing end-of-week reports and planning for the company's next phase. None of them knew that one of their recently terminated employees, Jinghua Wu, was on his way back to the building with a loaded handgun. Earlier that morning, the 56-year-old engineer had been called into a meeting with management. He had worked for Seaport for roughly 2.5 years, a highly educated professional specializing in testing and production processes, but his supervisors said his performance wasn't meeting expectations. After a tense discussion, he was informed that his employment was ending immediately. Accounts differ on how he reacted. Some described him as quiet and withdrawn. Others said he appeared stunned but calm. Either way, he walked out of the building without incident. For a few hours, it seemed the matter was over. Around mid-afternoon, Wu returned. He carried a 9mm handgun. Security at the small startup was minimal. Seaport was the kind of company where employees came and went freely, and everyone knew one another. He walked through the same entrance he had used for years, moved down the hallway, and entered the conference room where the executives were still seated. Moments later, gunfire shattered the calm. Witnesses in nearby offices heard a rapid sequence of shots, followed by silence. Within seconds, all 3 executives lay dead, each struck in the head at close range. Wu left the building as panic spread through the complex. Employees ran for cover and called 911. Santa Clara police arrived within minutes to find the victims lifeless inside the meeting room. Officers secured the scene, began interviewing witnesses, and launched an urgent manhunt. Wu had fled in his car, disappearing into the sprawling neighborhoods of Silicon Valley. Overnight, law enforcement agencies from across the Bay Area joined the search. His name and photograph were circulated statewide, and by the next morning, the trail led to a parking area where he was found and arrested without resistance. The following day, police publicly confirmed the victims: Sid Agrawal, age 56, Brian Pugh, age 47, and Marilyn Lewis, age 67. Each had been central to the company's leadership, and each was targeted because of their role in the firing earlier that day. Investigators recovered the handgun and traced it to Wu. There were no other suspects. Prosecutors filed 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with firearm enhancements and a special circumstance multiple murder allegation that made him eligible for life without parole, and, initially, the death penalty. The district attorney later chose not to seek execution. Over the next several years, the case moved slowly through Santa Clara County Superior Court. Wu's defense argued that he had suffered a mental breakdown, pointing to stress, workplace humiliation, and cultural isolation after losing his job. They claimed he was legally insane when he returned to the office that day. Prosecutors countered that his actions were deliberate. He had left, retrieved a gun, and come back, a clear, calculated decision. In March 2013, a jury found him guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. 2 weeks later, in a separate sanity phase, that same jury concluded that he was legally sane at the time of the killings. The court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 75 years for firearm enhancements. For Silicon Valley, the killings sent shockwaves through a community known for innovation, not violence. Seaport had been a small but promising firm developing digital radio technology. Its headquarters, once a symbol of entrepreneurial optimism, became a memorial site where employees and families placed flowers and notes. Friends of the victims remembered Agrawal as a visionary leader, Pugh as a talented operations expert, and Lewis as the heart of the company who had worked there since its founding. The tragedy exposed the darker pressures lurking beneath the region's competitive, high-stakes culture, a reminder that personal despair can turn lethal when anger and access to a weapon converge. Years later, court records confirm that Jinghua Wu remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence without parole. The events of November 14th, 2008, stand as one of the most haunting examples of workplace revenge in Silicon Valley's history. 3 lives lost over a single act of rage on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. Number 5. Tyrese Haspel. He was young, brilliant, and trusted. Tyrese Devin Haspel had started working for tech entrepreneur Fahim Saleh when he was barely out of his teens. In the fast-moving world of startups and digital innovation, he was the kind of assistant every founder wanted: sharp, efficient, and loyal. But behind the polished professionalism, prosecutors later said, Haspel was quietly stealing from the man who had given him opportunity. Over the course of 2 years, he siphoned nearly $400,000 from Saleh's accounts, using a tangle of fake PayPal transactions and shell accounts. When the theft began to unravel, that betrayal would spiral into one of New York City's most gruesome killings in recent memory. By early 2020, Saleh, a 33-year-old millionaire entrepreneur known for ventures like Pathao and Gokada, had discovered irregularities in his company's finances. The thief, he realized, was his own assistant. Instead of reporting him to police, Saleh confronted Haspel privately. Friends later said he believed in giving people a second chance. He offered the young man a repayment plan, a chance to make things right without ruining his future. Haspel agreed, but the arrangement was short-lived. Rather than paying Saleh back, he kept stealing, using newly forged accounts to cover the old ones. It was a cycle that could only end one way. In the weeks leading up to the murder, investigators later found Haspel began preparing. He searched online for taser models, cleaning chemicals, and power tools. He bought a taser, a vacuum, and masks. He studied the layout of Saleh's Lower East Side apartment, a luxury duplex where the elevator opened directly into the living room. Then, in the early hours of July 13, 2020, he put his plan into motion. Around 8:30 that morning, surveillance footage captured Saleh stepping into his private elevator with a tall figure dressed head to toe in black, suit, gloves, and a motorcycle-style mask. The doors closed. Moments later, they opened directly into the apartment. As Saleh stepped forward, the masked man tased him in the back, sending him to the floor. What happened next was brutal but brief. Haspel stabbed him multiple times in the neck and torso, killing him almost instantly. The attack was deliberate, controlled, and planned to the second. Over the next several hours, he stayed in the apartment cleaning and organizing the scene. Prosecutors said he tried to vacuum up the tiny plastic tags ejected by the taser, forensic markers that could trace the weapon back to him. Then he left, locking the door behind him. But the next day, he came back. Carrying plastic bags, gloves, and an electric saw, he began the slow process of dismembering the body. When the saw's battery died, he left to buy a charger from a nearby Home Depot, using the victim's credit card to pay for it. While he was gone, fate intervened. Saleh's cousin, worried that calls had gone unanswered, arrived for a welfare check. She found blood on the floor and a dismembered body beside a running saw. The killer had been gone for less than an hour. The discovery sent shockwaves through New York. Detectives with the NYPD homicide unit secured the apartment and quickly connected the purchases and surveillance footage to Haspel. Within days, they found him hiding in a rented Airbnb in the Soho area, booked under his name for his girlfriend's birthday. He was arrested on July 17, 2020, 4 days after the killing. Inside the apartment, police found clothing, receipts, and digital evidence linking him directly to the murder and the embezzlement that motivated it. Over the next 4 years, the case wound its way through the Manhattan Supreme Court. Prosecutors laid out the full timeline: the thefts dating back to 2018, the confrontation and repayment plan in January 2020, and the meticulous preparation that followed. They argued it was cold-blooded premeditation, not a moment of panic. The defense countered that Haspel had acted under extreme emotional disturbance, claiming shame and romantic turmoil had clouded his judgment. The evidence told a different story: spreadsheets, search histories, and hardware purchases that painted a picture of planning and control. On June 24, 2024, a jury found him guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, grand larceny, burglary, and tampering with evidence. The verdict ended one of the most widely covered tech industry crimes of the decade. In September, the court sentenced him to 40 years to life in prison, ordering restitution for the money he had stolen. For those who knew Fahim Saleh, the case was more than a headline. He was a self-made innovator, a man who built companies in emerging markets and mentored young entrepreneurs. Friends said he treated employees like family, which made the betrayal all the more devastating. In the end, his generosity toward a trusted assistant cost him his life. Number 6. Gary Curtis. He was 58 years old, a former employee with decades of experience in the utilities field. Gary Curtis had once worked for Public Service Electric and Gas Company, known locally as PSE&G, in Somerset County, New Jersey. But by February of 2023, his time with the company had ended under difficult circumstances. Investigators would later say Curtis carried lingering resentment toward one man in particular, his former supervisor, Russell D. Heller. That resentment, rooted in workplace discipline and pride, would soon ignite into an act of calculated violence that stunned the quiet community of Franklin Township. It was a cold Wednesday morning, February 8th, just after sunrise. Employees were arriving at PSE&G's Somerset Central Division headquarters on Weston Canal Road, a sprawling complex surrounded by chain-link fencing and open fields. Heller, age 51, was a senior distribution supervisor, known for being professional, steady, and well-liked. In addition to his day job, he also served as an elected councilman in Milford Borough, a small town about 30 miles away. That morning, like any other, he parked his car in the lot before beginning his shift. Minutes later, Curtis drove onto the property. Authorities believe he had been waiting for the right moment. Around 7 a.m., he stepped out of his vehicle, approached Heller in the parking lot, and opened fire. Witnesses reported hearing multiple shots echo across the yard, then the sound of tires screeching as a car sped away. When officers arrived, they found Heller near his car, suffering from fatal gunshot wounds. Paramedics could only confirm what was already clear. He had died instantly. The attack was quick, targeted, and left behind no doubt that Heller had been the intended victim. Detectives immediately launched a manhunt. They circulated Curtis's name and vehicle description to police across the region. By mid-morning, the search extended into neighboring Bridgewater Township, where license plate readers and surveillance cameras helped track his movements. At approximately 10:20 a.m., officers located his vehicle parked near TD Bank Ballpark, a commuter area just a few miles from the shooting site. Inside, they found Curtis dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. A handgun lay nearby. With the suspect deceased, investigators turned to motive. The Somerset County Prosecutor's Office quickly confirmed that Curtis had once worked under Heller at PSE&G. He had been subject to disciplinary action before leaving the company, and evidence suggested that the killing stemmed directly from that workplace grievance. Officials stressed that the incident was not politically motivated, despite Heller's public office. It was, they said, a tragedy born out of resentment and unresolved anger. In the days that followed, tributes to Russell Heller poured in from across New Jersey. His colleagues at PSE&G described him as kind and dedicated, a man who treated coworkers with fairness and respect. The Milford Borough Council held a moment of silence, remembering him as a community-minded public servant who always showed up ready to help. For residents, the news was difficult to process. A respected councilman and longtime employee gunned down by a former colleague in a parking lot where he should have been safe. Police later released the timeline in full. The shooting occurred around 7 a.m. Heller pronounced dead minutes later. By 10:20 a.m., Curtis had taken his own life. No one else was injured, and no ongoing threat remained. The investigation formally concluded within days, closing a case that had lasted barely 3 hours from first shot to final discovery. Yet, the emotional aftermath would linger far longer for Heller's family, for co-workers who witnessed the violence, and for a company forced to confront how an ordinary workplace dispute had turned fatal. Number 7. Andrew Engeldinger. It was late afternoon in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on September 27, 2012. The hum of machinery filled the air inside Accent Signage Systems, a small but successful manufacturing business tucked into a quiet street in the Bryn Mawr neighborhood. Workers moved between printing stations and assembly tables, wrapping up the day's production. In his office, company founder Reuven Rahamim, a 61-year-old entrepreneur known for treating his employees like family, was finishing paperwork when a sound pierced the calm. A gunshot, then another, echoing down the hallway. Moments earlier, Andrew John Engeldinger, a 36-year-old press operator, had been called into a meeting with management. For years, he'd worked under Rahamim, producing high-quality tactile signage for clients around the country. But his recent performance had declined, and management had decided it was time to let him go. He entered the office knowing his employment was being terminated that day. What no one knew was that he had a Glock 19 pistol hidden in his briefcase. The meeting began like any other termination conference: professional, procedural, quiet. Then, according to surviving witnesses, Engeldinger suddenly drew the gun. He fired first at Rami Cooks, a 62-year-old manager seated nearby, killing him instantly. John Suter, the operations director, was struck and fell to the floor critically wounded. Startled by the gunfire, Reuven Rahamim stepped from his adjacent office into the corridor. Engeldinger turned and shot him multiple times, ending the life of the man who had founded the company nearly 3 decades earlier. As the first shots rang out, chaos swept through the building. Employees hid under desks or ran for the exits, while Engeldinger moved methodically from room to room. He walked into the production area, where he shot Jacob Benecke, a 34-year-old designer, before continuing toward the loading dock. There, he encountered Keith Basinski, a 50-year-old UPS driver making a routine delivery, and Ronald Edberg, a 58-year-old worker. Both were killed instantly. In the production bay, Eric Rivers, a 42-year-old supervisor, was shot and gravely wounded. He would survive for nearly 2 weeks before succumbing to his injuries in the hospital, becoming the 6th victim. The entire attack lasted only a few minutes, from about 4:30 to 4:35 p.m. When the shooting stopped, responding officers from the Minneapolis Police Department moved cautiously through the building, finding bodies across multiple rooms and hallways. They eventually discovered Engeldinger's own body inside the factory, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Near him lay the handgun and extra ammunition. It was Minnesota's deadliest workplace shooting. In the hours that followed, detectives worked to understand what had driven a longtime employee to turn on his coworkers. Evidence showed that Engeldinger had been terminated just hours earlier. Investigators described the attack as premeditated retaliation, an act of rage directed towards supervisors and anyone who happened to be nearby. Family members later revealed that he had become increasingly isolated in the years leading up to the shooting, withdrawing from relatives and refusing help for suspected mental health issues. Still, the company and coworkers said they saw no immediate warning signs that day. Authorities pieced together the sequence of violence from the survivors' accounts, ballistic evidence, and security footage. The first shots were fired inside the management offices, followed by a deliberate movement through production areas and the warehouse. Within 5 minutes, 6 people were dead or dying, 2 were wounded, and the shooter was gone by his own hand. By that evening, police confirmed that all victims had been identified and that no further threat remained. The city of Minneapolis grieved alongside the families of the victims. Vigils were held outside the Accent Signage building, and flowers covered the front steps where employees had once entered each morning. Colleagues described Reuven Rahamim as a generous employer and a visionary craftsman who treated his staff with respect. Many said he had built a workplace that felt more like a community than a corporation, a place where tragedies like this had always felt impossible. Number 8. Gary Martin. He was 45 years old, a longtime worker at a manufacturing plant on the west side of Aurora, Illinois. To his co-workers, Gary Montez Martin was quiet, often withdrawn, and known for keeping to himself. But on February 15, 2019, that silence would erupt into one of the most violent workplace shootings in Illinois history, a calculated act of revenge that began inside a conference room and ended with 6 people dead, including the company's plant manager, Josh Pinkard. That Friday morning began like countless others at the Henry Pratt Company, a century-old manufacturer of industrial valves. The factory floor buzzed with the sound of machinery, metal clanging against metal, forklifts humming between aisles. Inside a small meeting room near the front office, several supervisors gathered to conduct what was supposed to be a routine termination meeting. Among them was Josh Pinkard, the 37-year-old plant manager who had joined the company only a year earlier. Beside him sat Clayton Parks, the human resources manager, and Trevor Weiner, a 21-year-old intern whose first day on the job would also be his last. They were there to deliver the final notice to one man, Gary Martin. Records show that Martin had been employed at the plant for about 15 years, but in recent months, performance issues and disciplinary problems had mounted. Shortly after 1:20 p.m., he was called into the meeting room to be informed of his termination. What no one in that room knew was that Martin had arrived that day carrying a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson M&P pistol fitted with a laser sight. He had illegally obtained the gun years earlier, concealing it from authorities despite a 1995 felony conviction in Mississippi that legally barred him from owning firearms. The meeting started, the paperwork was presented, and then, without warning, he drew the gun. The first shots were deafening inside the small room. Witnesses outside later said they heard a rapid series of cracks, followed by screams. Within seconds, the three men nearest him, Pinkard, Parks, and Weiner, were struck. Two other employees were killed nearby, Russ Bayer, a union chairman who had worked with Martin for years, and Vicente Juarez, a stockroom attendant and forklift operator. The rampage spread from the office to the factory floor, where workers ran for cover behind heavy equipment, calling 911 from their cell phones as gunfire echoed through the metal walls. At 1:24 p.m., Aurora police received the first emergency call. Officers were on the scene within minutes, but as they entered the building, Martin opened fire again. 5 officers were hit in the chaotic exchange, some struck before they could even clear the doorway. The building became a maze of noise, alarms, and confusion, hundreds of thousands of square feet of industrial corridors, each one a potential trap. For nearly 90 minutes, police teams searched room by room, locating wounded employees and escorting survivors outside, while others tried to pin down the shooter's position. By 2:59 p.m., the gunfire had stopped. Inside the warehouse, officers found Gary Martin dead from police gunfire. Around him lay the pistol, spent shell casings, and a backpack filled with extra ammunition. In the aftermath, investigators pieced together the timeline: the termination meeting, the rapid killings, the running gun battle that followed. He had known his firing was coming. Evidence later showed he'd told co-workers he would handle it his way if he ever lost his job, though those statements had never been reported to management. The investigation also uncovered a troubling paper trail. Years earlier, when Martin applied for an Illinois firearm owner's identification card, a background check mistakenly cleared him. Only when he later applied for a concealed carry permit did the system flag his prior felony. Authorities sent a notice revoking his firearm ID and ordering him to surrender his weapon, but he never did. The gun he used at Henry Pratt that day was the same one he had been told to give up 5 years earlier. In the days following the shooting, the city of Aurora grieved publicly. Vigils were held for the victims, including Josh Pinkard, described by friends as a devoted father of 3 and a man who always placed safety and family first. His wife shared a heartbreaking text message he managed to send in his final moments, just 2 words: "I love you." The tragedy prompted calls for reform in firearm licensing and workplace safety protocols across Illinois, and renewed scrutiny of how background checks are enforced. Number 9. Amy Bishop. It was late afternoon on February 12, 2010, inside the Shelby Center for Science and Technology at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. On the 3rd floor, a small group of professors gathered around a long conference table for what was supposed to be a routine biology department faculty meeting. The atmosphere was quiet, formal, and familiar. Just another Friday discussion about schedules, funding, and research updates. But within minutes, the room would become the site of one of the most shocking acts of workplace violence in academic history. At the far end of the table sat Dr. Amy Bishop, a 44-year-old associate professor of biology. She was intelligent, outspoken, and known to be intense about her work. Only a year earlier, Bishop had been denied tenure, a career-defining setback that had placed her job and reputation in jeopardy. Though the meeting that day was not specifically about tenure, It brought her face to face with the very people she blamed for her stalled career, including Dr. Gopi Podila, the 52-year-old department chair. Podila was respected among his colleagues, a gifted researcher and teacher who had guided the department through years of growth. He had no idea that one of his own faculty members had brought a gun to the meeting. The session began around 4 o'clock. Papers rustled, laptops clicked, and the conversation moved from departmental budgets to course assignments. Then, without a word, Bishop reached into her bag and pulled out a Ruger 9mm pistol. Before anyone could react, she aimed across the table and fired. The first shots struck the professors nearest to her. Witnesses later said there was no argument, no warning, just the deafening sound of gunfire ricocheting off the walls of the small conference room. Within seconds, chaos overtook the meeting. Dr. Gopi Podila, seated near the head of the table, was hit and collapsed where he sat. Dr. Maria Ragland Davis and Dr. Adriel Johnson Sr., both 52, were fatally wounded before they could move. 3 others, Dr. Joseph Leahy, Stephanie Monticello, and Dr. Luis Cruz Vera, were struck by gunfire but survived. Those still conscious dove to the floor or fled the room as Bishop continued firing. The entire incident lasted less than a minute. When the gun finally jammed, she stopped, set the weapon aside, and walked out into the hallway as colleagues screamed for help. Campus police and Huntsville officers arrived within minutes. They found students hiding behind laboratory doors and faculty barricading themselves inside offices. Bishop was located outside the building, calm and expressionless, still wearing the same clothes she'd worn to the meeting. She was taken into custody without resistance. Inside, officers discovered the Ruger pistol on the floor, spent shell casings scattered across the room, and the bodies of 3 professors who had spent their lives in the pursuit of science and education. In the hours that followed, investigators pieced together what had led to the shooting. Bishop had been denied tenure in March of 2009, a decision that effectively meant the end of her academic career at UAH. While colleagues described her as brilliant, they also noted growing frustration and paranoia after the decision. Reports differ on whether she believed the meeting that day involved tenure discussions, but official statements confirmed it was a routine departmental session, not a review. Regardless, the denial remained her central grievance, and prosecutors later identified it as the likely motive. 2 years later, in September 2012, Bishop pleaded guilty to capital murder for killing multiple victims and to 3 counts of attempted murder. Under Alabama law, the plea required a brief jury proceeding to confirm the sentence. The court sentenced her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a punishment she continues to serve at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women. Her later appeals were denied. For the families of the victims, especially those of Dr. Gopi Podila, the pain was immeasurable. Podila had devoted his life to mentoring students and advancing biological research. Colleagues described him as generous, patient, and deeply dedicated to his faculty. His death, along with those of Davis and Johnson, left a permanent void in the university community. Memorial scholarships were established in their names, ensuring their work would continue through future generations of scientists. The Huntsville shooting of 2010 stands as one of the darkest moments in American academia, a tragic example of how personal grievance and professional rejection can spiral into irreversible violence. What began as a routine meeting among scholars ended in bloodshed, shattering lives and careers in an instant. Number 10. Jonathan Morris. He began wearing the uniform and smile of a team member, but by midnight, he would arrive as something far more dangerous. Jonathan Morris, age 21, had once worked under Ryan Johnson, age 32, at a Taco Bell restaurant in Cincinnati's Queensgate area. Shortly after being terminated the day before, Morris returned at about 12:10 a.m. on August 29, 2025, and gunned down his former manager, Ryan Johnson, in the parking lot of the Jest Street location. Johnson was pronounced dead at the scene. The Cincinnati Police Department later arrested Morris on October 15th and charged him with murder. It was just after midnight when the quiet lot outside the Taco Bell should have been empty, except for cleaning crews and late-night maintenance. Johnson was wrapping up his shift, finishing checks, and stepping out for a brief break when Morris appeared. Investigators allege Morris pulled a firearm and opened fire. Johnson was struck multiple times, The official media release from the Cincinnati Police Department states he died at the scene from gunshot wounds. Moments later, Morris fled into the night. Responding officers arrived, secured the scene, and began canvassing surveillance footage and witness statements. In the days that followed, police reviewed employee records and learned that Morris had been terminated the previous day. Local news outlets reported the firing as a direct catalyst for the attack. At his first court appearance, bond was set at $500,000, with 24/7 monitoring if released. With the arrest on October 15th, the homicide unit formally announced the murder charge against Jonathan Morris. The motive, as stated by prosecutors in court, centers on a workplace grievance. Johnson had been Morris's manager and had participated in the decision to terminate him. Police said the shooting was triggered by that termination. Beyond that, details remain limited. Official statements specify the firing, but do not elaborate on planning or communications in the interim. Reports differ on whether Morris made threats in the hours between the firing and the shooting. The premiere of surveillance footage and cell phone metadata helped investigators locate Morris. They tracked him through video and eventually arrested him in late October, concluding a 6-week investigation. The scene, investigators say, involved Morris arriving in the lot, confronting Johnson, and opening fire without reported hesitation. The killing lasted only moments, but left a manager dead, colleagues traumatized, and a community on edge. For those at the restaurant, the tragedy upended what had been a routine break time shift. Johnson, father of 7, was remembered by family and staff as a dependable leader, someone who worked long hours and cared about his team. The Taco Bell parking lot, where he often loaded supplies at dawn, became a crime scene memorial overnight. Number 11. David Browning. She arrived home on Sandgate Road in Brighton just after closing time, stepping into the quiet flat where she often unwound after a day at work. Dr. Jillian Howell, a 46-year-old payroll manager at the University of Brighton and dedicated Samaritan volunteer, had no reason to suspect the horror waiting for her inside. The evening of late October 2017 would end in violence so sudden and brutal that the city would shudder for weeks to come. Earlier that year, her deputy in the department, David Browning, a 52-year-old finance staff member, had developed a troubling fixation on her. Colleagues observed how his behavior shifted, how he gravitated toward her professional space, how he seemed increasingly dependent on her guidance. While she supported him through his father's death and his struggles with depression, the boundaries between manager and subordinate blurred in ways that would later unravel into tragedy. On the night of October 25th, Browning entered Howell's flat. Reports differ on the exact hour, but investigators confirm the incident occurred late that evening, with the body discovered on October 26th. Without warning, Browning struck. He produced a knife and delivered approximately 15 stab or slash wounds to her chest, neck, and abdomen. When the assault was over, he defaced her remains, using a marker to scrawl the single word bully across her forehead. That word remains the chilling horn of the shocked friend, now victim detail, that underscored motive and mindset. Within minutes, or perhaps hours, Browning handed himself in to nearby Sussex police officers, calmly reported what he'd done, and was arrested. He made no attempt to flee. The weapon was recovered, the scene secured, and the police investigation began in full that night. In the days that followed, detectives collected forensic evidence. The knife, the inked message on Howell's forehead, Browning's digital history, and his growing obsession with her, all laid bare in court documents. At trial in Hove Crown Court in April and May of 2018, Browning admitted to manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility but denied murder. The jury deliberated for about 2 hours and 20 minutes before returning a unanimous verdict of guilty of murder on May 2nd, 2018. On May 3rd, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 28 years. The judge described the attack as sustained, sadistic, and betraying every expectation of workplace safety. For Jillian Howell's family and colleagues, the man who had served under her trust turned on her in the darkest way imaginable. Her life ended not in the tyranny of an anonymous threat, but in the breach of professional faith. The University of Brighton and the wider academic community mourned the researcher and mentor who had devoted her days to science, payroll management, and compassionate volunteering. In the wake of the case, attention turned to warning signs in workplace relationships. the hazards when professional support shifts into obsession, and the frightening speed at which a manager-employee grievance can escalate into murder. The Brighton murder of 2017 serves as a grim reminder of how hidden resentments, unaddressed emotional turmoil, and working world power imbalances can explode into tragedy. Number 12. Shahzeb Khalid. He had come to the United Kingdom searching for opportunity and stability. 36-year-old Vignesh Pattabiraman, originally from India, managed the small South Indian restaurant Vel in Reading. Colleagues described him as disciplined, kind, and meticulous, a man who treated his staff with the same quiet respect he demanded from himself. But in the late hours of February 14, 2024, as Valentine's Day came to a close, Vignesh's ride home along Addington Road was violently cut short. Just before midnight, emergency services were called to a scene that looked at first like a tragic hit-and-run. A cyclist had been thrown from his bike, the frame mangled in the glare of the streetlights. Medics rushed him to Royal Berkshire Hospital, but within minutes, he was pronounced dead from a catastrophic head injury. Investigators soon realized this had not been an accident. Tire marks, vehicle fragments, and security footage began to reveal intent. The victim had been deliberately struck by a stolen Range Rover that never stopped. 5 days later, detectives arrested 25-year-old Shahzeb Khalid, a man who had once worked under Vignesh's management. The following day, he was charged with murder. As the inquiry deepened, prosecutors uncovered a disturbing motive. Khalid had convinced himself that Vignesh was responsible for reporting the restaurant to immigration authorities, supposedly triggering an investigation that could affect staff visas. It was a misguided belief, police later said, an imagined slight that metastasized into homicidal rage. Court records show that Khalid and an associate, 27-year-old Soheem Hussain, had taken the Range Rover earlier that night. Driving through the quiet streets of Reading, Khalid spotted Vignesh cycling home and accelerated toward him. Witnesses recalled a single, sickening impact, followed by silence. The vehicle sped away, leaving the restaurant manager dying on the pavement. By dawn, Khalid had hidden the vehicle and gone to ground, while detectives began the painstaking work of tracing the car's movements through CCTV, mobile data, and forensic residue. Within days, both men were in custody. Hussain was accused of assisting Khalid after the fact, while Khalid faced a full murder charge. During the 28-day trial at Reading Crown Court in September 2024, jurors were shown the reconstructed crash sequence and heard evidence of Khalid's simmering resentment toward his former boss. Prosecutors said the defendant had weaponized the car in an act of revenge. Some media outlets referenced a £2,000 contract payment allegedly linked to the attack, though official sentencing records did not confirm that claim beyond the immigration grievance motive. On September 11th, the jury returned a guilty verdict for murder. 4 weeks later, on October 8th, judge imposed life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. Hussain was cleared of murder, but convicted of assisting an offender, receiving a 4-year sentence. In court, detectives emphasized the cruelty of using a car as a weapon against an unsuspecting man heading home from work. The story left the Reading community shaken. Vignesh had lived in the UK barely a year, working diligently, sending money to family, and building a future that ended under headlights and asphalt. For his loved ones, the idea that a valued employee could be killed by one of his own staff was almost beyond belief. Khalid's act of vengeance destroyed 2 lives, the victim's and his own, and left a permanent scar on everyone connected to the restaurant. Number 13. Jonathan Warg Lamani. It was a quiet afternoon at the Oxfordshire Golf Club in Thame, a place known more for calm and routine than for violence. Inside the restaurant, staff moved between shifts, while 32-year-old Christopher Varian, the restaurant manager, oversaw the day's work. He had earned a reputation for being fair and steady, respected by his team. But that afternoon, what began as an ordinary workday would end in one of the most shocking crimes the region had ever seen. At around 3 o'clock on August 21st, 2010, emergency services were called to the club's loading bay. When officers arrived, they found that Chris had been attacked and killed by one of his employees, Jonathan Warg Lamani, a 33-year-old waiter. Lamani had used a knife to carry out the assault, and officers arrested him at the scene without resistance. What first appeared to be a sudden outburst soon revealed deeper layers of instability and mental illness. Police and forensic teams worked through the weekend, interviewing witnesses and gathering evidence from the service area where the killing occurred. Early reports suggested that Lamani's behavior in the days before the incident had been increasingly erratic. He had a documented history of psychiatric problems, and court experts later diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. Prosecutors determined that his mental state at the time of the killing was severely abnormal, leading them to accept a plea of manslaughter by diminished responsibility rather than murder. The case went before Oxford Crown Court in March 2012. Lamani admitted to killing his manager, but told the court he had not been fully aware of his actions. The judge accepted psychiatric evidence and sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years, ordering that he first be detained at Broadmoor Hospital under the Mental Health Act before eventual transfer to prison if his condition improved. Investigators could not point to a single workplace dispute or act of revenge as the cause. While Lamani and Varian worked closely, there was no clear history of conflict between them. The court concluded that the killing had arisen entirely from a breakdown of reality, not a calculated act. For Chris Varian's family and colleagues, the verdict brought little comfort. Number 14. Shane Freer. He was only 20 years old, but the anger that brewed inside him that spring morning would alter lives forever. Shane Freer had worked behind the counter at a McDonald's in Chichester, England, a young man described by those who knew him as quiet, detached, and often struggling to understand how others felt. Co-workers noticed his odd mannerisms, but no one imagined that beneath his calm surface, resentment was slowly hardening into something far darker. Days before the tragedy, Freer had been disciplined for striking a teenage customer during an argument over a tray of food. It was the latest in a series of incidents that made management question whether he could continue working there. On April 16, 2005, he was called into a small office at the back of the restaurant for a final meeting. Inside waited Jackie Marshall, a 50-something restaurant manager known for her patience and warmth, especially with younger staff. The decision had been made. Freer's employment was terminated for gross misconduct. The conversation lasted only minutes, but the words cut deep. Witnesses later said he appeared calm as he left, saying little. What happened next revealed that his quietness wasn't acceptance, it was calculation. Leaving the restaurant, Freer walked down Terminus Road to a nearby ironmonger's shop. There, he purchased an 8-inch hunting knife for £32 and 95 pence. He left the store with the weapon concealed and returned to the same McDonald's he'd just been fired from. It was lunchtime. Families were celebrating a child's birthday in one corner. Teenagers clustered near the counter. Among them was Jackie Marshall, busy ensuring the restaurant ran smoothly, completely unaware that Freer had come back armed and filled with rage. Without warning, he stepped inside, pushed through the diners, and confronted her. Witnesses recalled a brief exchange, a single, heated moment, before he lunged. He punched her once, then began stabbing her repeatedly in front of horrified customers and children. Panic erupted. Parents grabbed their kids and fled. Employees screamed for help. Within seconds, what had been a normal Saturday afternoon turned into chaos. Police and paramedics rushed to the scene, but Jackie Marshall's injuries were catastrophic. She was taken to hospital, where she succumbed shortly after arrival. The attack was so sudden, so public, that investigators immediately began piecing together what could drive a dismissed employee to such savagery. CCTV, eyewitness accounts, and the timeline of his movements made the sequence unmistakable. The dismissal, the walk to the shop, the purchase of the knife, and the deliberate return. Freer was arrested without resistance. In the days that followed, shock rippled through the community. McDonald's issued statements of grief and support for staff and customers traumatized by what they had witnessed. Jackie Marshall was remembered as a kind-hearted manager who had worked there for nearly 15 years. When the case reached Lewis Crown Court the following year, prosecutors charged Freer with murder. But psychiatric assessments painted a more complex picture. Doctors testified that he suffered from Asperger's syndrome and had significant difficulty processing emotion and understanding consequence. The defense argued diminished responsibility. On that basis, Freer pleaded guilty to manslaughter. The presiding judge, Anthony Scott Gall, described the attack as a cold-blooded act of anger and revenge. Acknowledging the medical findings, he ordered that Freer be detained indefinitely in a secure psychiatric hospital under the Mental Health Act. Reports differ on Jackie Marshall's exact age. Some list 56, others 57, but every account agrees she was a veteran manager who died doing her job. Number 15. Gabriel DeWitt Wilson. He was a familiar face at the Stop and Shop in West Hempstead, New York. To some, Gabriel DeWitt Wilson was quiet and polite, keeping to himself as he gathered carts or worked in the aisles. To others, he was unpredictable, an employee whose frustration simmered just beneath the surface. By April of 2021, that tension had reached a breaking point. That Tuesday morning began like any other inside the Cherry Valley Avenue supermarket. Shoppers pushed carts down bright, polished aisles while upstairs, in the second-floor manager's offices, daily schedules were being reviewed. At about 11:15 a.m., Wilson entered the building. He had worked there before, and no one stopped him when he walked up the familiar stairway toward management. Minutes later, gunfire tore through the silence. Witnesses said the first shots came from the upper level near the offices where supervisors coordinated staff. Within seconds, terrified employees shouted for customers to run. On the floor below, parents abandoned shopping carts and grabbed their children, sprinting for the exits. Upstairs, chaos unfolded in close quarters. Wilson had brought a loaded semi-automatic handgun and was firing at the people he blamed for his problems. He shot one manager in the face and chest, another in the shoulder. Then he turned toward 49-year-old Raymond Ray Wishrop, the store's grocery manager. Wishrop had been on his lunch break when Wilson confronted him. At point-blank range, Wilson fired again, striking him in the chest and leg. Wishrop collapsed and died almost instantly. In less than a minute, the attack was over. Wilson fled down the stairwell, leaving behind shattered glass and wounded colleagues crying for help. Police from across Nassau County descended on the area as emergency teams rushed the two surviving victims to nearby hospitals. Officers locked down surrounding blocks, warning residents to shelter indoors. For several tense hours, Wilson was on the run. Just before 4 p.m., detectives traced him to an apartment building in nearby Hempstead. Surveillance teams moved in and took him into custody without further violence. The arrest ended a manhunt that had gripped Long Island through the afternoon and left the community stunned. Inside the West Hempstead store, investigators recovered shell casings and reviewed security footage that documented Wilson's path through the building almost step by step. As police questioned witnesses, a clearer picture of motive began to emerge. Wilson had been a former employee, described by the Nassau County District Attorney as a troubled and disgruntled worker. He had been disciplined in the past for threatening behavior and inappropriate conduct, including harassment complaints. On the day of the shooting, he had reportedly met with supervisors to discuss a possible transfer, a conversation that ended roughly 40 minutes before he returned with a weapon. Prosecutors later described the assault as an act of deliberate retaliation, a targeted workplace attack against managers he believed had wronged him. In 2023, after a full trial in Nassau County Court, the jury found Wilson guilty of second-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, assault, and criminal possession of a weapon. The verdict came swiftly, after less than 6 hours of deliberation. During sentencing in early June of that year, the judge imposed a term of 50 years to life in prison, citing the calculated nature of the attack and the lasting trauma it caused. Wilson, now 33, showed little emotion as the ruling was read. Prosecutors called the case a chilling example of workplace rage turned deadly. Number 16. Kevin Ingram. Alexander Stengel walked into work that morning at the Pizza Hut on Chicago Avenue in South Milwaukee with the steady focus of a seasoned manager who had applied 15 years of experience to keep his staff and customers safe. He clocked in, headed toward the back kitchen area, and began his routine duties among the clatter of pans and the hum of pizza ovens. Moments earlier, no one could have foreseen that this typical shift would become the setting for a horrific betrayal. Downstairs, in the same building, 31-year-old Kevin Ingram arrived for his shift as a restaurant employee, familiar with the layout and the day's flow. Around 10:25 a.m., surveillance video captured a large wheeled trash can being rolled out of the back of the restaurant and toward the dumpster area. At nearly the same time, cell phone data showed Alex's phone shifted from the upstairs office to outside surveillance zones. Not long after, A text message sent from his phone asked the general manager for the door code, a message investigators later said was typed by someone else in order to mask the victim's disappearance. At approximately 11 a.m. on February 7, 2024, the body of Alex Stengel was discovered by a garbage truck driver behind the restaurant. The man alerted police after hearing a heavy object inside the metal-wheeled container and seeing what looked like limbs. When officers arrived, they found that the victim had suffered a contact gunshot wound to the head, attempted throat slashing, and multiple puncture wounds. A phenotype test indicated blood in the utility sink area and kitchen floor had been cleaned up, and traces of cleaning agents were found. Inside the trash can, Alex's body lay wrapped and partially concealed, dragged from the kitchen to the dumpster zone. As detectives reviewed store system logs and time cards, they discovered that Alex had been recorded as clocked out shortly after his phone sent the text. Bus transit cameras and building entry footage traced a man matching Ingram's description, leaving the premises with the trash can shortly before the body was found. A cell tower mapping sequence tied his phone's movement to the area around Hempstead Avenue later that afternoon. Investigators arrested Kevon Ingram on February 11, 2024. He was charged on February 16 with first-degree intentional homicide, hiding a corpse, armed robbery, and being a felon in possession of a firearm. In August that year, on August 19, Ingram pleaded guilty to first-degree reckless homicide and felon in possession. The other counts were dismissed, but read in at sentencing. On October 4, 2024, he was sentenced to 45 years in prison, described by outlets as 40 years on the homicide count, plus 5 years consecutive on the weapons charge, followed by 20 years of extended supervision. Reports differ slightly on the breakdown of supervision years. In the weeks leading to the incident, the victim had recently cashed an inheritance check of $7,000 and was seen showing a roll of cash while at work. Prosecutors allege that Ingram targeted Alex because of that money, framing the act as a workplace robbery turned deadly betrayal rather than a random act of violence. The motive thus combined workplace access, perceived grievance, and financial gain. Key details emerge from the forensic and video evidence. The attack took place in the back kitchen upstairs offices of the restaurant. The perpetrator used a firearm and apparently attempted to silence Alex via throat injury while disposing of the body in a trash container. The cleanup effort in the kitchen suggests premeditation, and the suspect's movements were traced via bus cameras, trash can tracking, and cell phone data, establishing his path from crime scene to escape. The victim's body was discovered 2 days later behind the store, prompting a homicide investigation that quickly focused on internal staff suspicion and digital forensics. The community remembers Alex Stengel as a steady leader who came to work to provide, guide, and protect his team. The betrayal by someone he supervised leaves a bitter memory. For Ingram, the case became a textbook example of how workplace resentment and financial motive can culminate in calculated violence. Number 17, Kerry Joe Tesney. He was once known as a reliable man on his route, a driver who had spent more than 2 decades in a brown UPS uniform, crisscrossing Birmingham streets, delivering packages with quiet consistency. But on the morning of September 23, 2014, Kerry Joe Tesney arrived at his old workplace, wearing that same uniform, this time not to deliver, but to destroy. 45 years old, Tesney had been terminated from his job just weeks earlier after more than 21 years with the company. His firing hit him hard. According to investigators, he had spent the following weeks appealing the decision, trying to get back the job that had defined much of his adult life. But on the day before the shooting, that appeal was officially denied. The next morning, he decided to act. At about 9:20 a.m., Tesney pulled into the UPS Customer Service Center on Inglenook Lane in Birmingham, Alabama. It was a sprawling facility, located near the airport, where hundreds of trucks moved through the bays every day. Around 80 drivers had already left on their morning routes, leaving only management and staff inside. Tesney parked his silver Honda SUV, stepped out dressed in his old brown uniform, and walked through one of the open truck bays that led directly into the building. It wasn't the normal entrance, but he knew the layout well enough to find his way. Inside, 2 supervisors were starting their day. Brian Callens, 46, was a longtime business manager, married, father of 2, and known among colleagues for being steady and fair. Douglas "Doug" Hutchison, 33, was a driver supervisor who had spent 15 years with the company. They were both in the office area near the sorting floor when Tesny entered, carrying a handgun. The first gunshots erupted just before 9:30. Workers still inside heard the echoes and fled through side doors, calling 911 as they ran. Dispatchers received the first emergency calls at about 9:21 a.m. When police and paramedics arrived minutes later, they found 3 bodies: Callens and Hutchison, both dead from gunshot wounds, and Tesny, who had turned the gun on himself. The weapon lay beside him on the floor. Detectives quickly pieced together what had happened. Tesny's firing and the failure of his appeal the day before had triggered a violent act of revenge against the men he believed responsible. He had returned to the facility in his uniform to avoid suspicion, walked straight past areas he knew would be empty, and sought out his 2 former supervisors. Investigators said it was a targeted attack, planned and directed, not random. The scene outside the UPS center was one of disbelief. Employees gathered behind police tape, many still wearing their brown uniforms, some crying, others staring in silence. Company officials confirmed the shooter's identity later that day, calling the incident a tragic loss for our UPS family. Both victims had worked alongside Tesny for years. Their tenures, Callens with 26 years and Hutchison with 15, spoke to a shared loyalty to the same company that Tesny had served for 21. As the coroner removed the bodies and investigators marked the evidence, Birmingham police noted that if the timing had been slightly different, the death toll could have been far worse. Nearly 80 drivers had already departed the facility minutes before the shooting began. Tesny's choice of time and place meant that only the supervisors were there when he arrived. Within hours, local and national outlets reported the story. A recently fired employee denied his appeal the day before, returning to kill his bosses before taking his own life. Police later confirmed the sequence and motive, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the attack. Friends and his pastor described Tesny as a man overwhelmed by job loss and financial pressure, but investigators focused on the simple, devastating truth. It was an act of calculated vengeance. For the Birmingham community, the killings at the UPS facility became one of the city's most shocking workplace tragedies in recent memory. The victims, both respected managers, were remembered by family and coworkers in vigils that followed, while UPS tightened security across local centers in the aftermath. Number 18. Tyrone Roy Ozen. It was a quiet Monday morning at the City of Houston's Solid Waste Management Department, the kind of morning where routine settled over the Southeast Service Center like a calm hum. Employees moved between offices, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights mixing with the clatter of keyboards and the smell of coffee. But inside the office of Deputy Assistant Director Michael Vaughn, that calm would soon be shattered by the sound of gunfire. At around 9:30 a.m., on December 21st, 2015, a veteran city employee named Tyrone Roy Ozen, 43 years old, walked through the doors of the facility on Central Street. He wasn't a stranger there. He worked under Vaughn's supervision, but in his bag that morning, he carried a loaded semi-automatic handgun. Colleagues would later recall that there had been tension in the workplace, quiet grievances about assignments, and perceived unfair treatment. Whether those frustrations had been brewing for days or months, no one could have predicted that this was the day they would erupt. Witnesses said the 2 men exchanged words in or near Vaughn's office. The conversation escalated fast. Moments later, the first shots rang out, echoing through the building's narrow hallways. Employees dropped to the floor or ran toward exits, calling 911 as they fled. When officers arrived minutes later, they found Michael Vaughn, 55, slumped inside his office, struck multiple times. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Police quickly moved through the building, expecting an active shooter. But what they found was something different. Tyrone Ozen hadn't fled. Instead, he had called 911 himself, placed the gun inside a gym bag, and waited for police to arrive. Officers detained him immediately and recovered the weapon. The motive, at first, seemed to hinge on anger and resentment. According to statements given later, Ozen told investigators he felt picked on unfairly by his boss. Prosecutors described it as a dispute that turned deadly, a moment of rage following a string of professional frustrations. In the aftermath, co-workers and city officials struggled to make sense of it. Vaughn, who had been recruited from Dallas to serve as a deputy assistant director, was remembered as a calm, respected leader known for mentoring younger staff. For the department, the loss was personal, a supervisor killed by one of his own team inside the very building where they had all worked side by side. As detectives processed the scene, they documented the gun, the shell casings, and the single office that had become a crime scene in the middle of a city facility. Outside, yellow tape cordoned off the parking lot as news crews gathered, reporting the tragedy to a stunned public. In the weeks that followed, Auzen was charged with murder and released on a $50,000 bond under strict conditions, GPS monitoring, and a nightly curfew. The case moved slowly through Harris County Court. Over the next few years, it became clear that both men's paths within the department had once been intertwined by ambition. Vaughn had been selected to fill a management role that Auzen reportedly sought himself, a detail that, according to family members, fueled feelings of jealousy and humiliation. When the case finally reached its conclusion in May of 2019, nearly 4 years after the shooting, Tyrone Roy Auzen stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to murder. The plea spared him a trial, but sealed his fate. The court sentenced him to 19 years in state prison. Family members of Michael Vaughn addressed the court, describing their grief and the senselessness of the act that took away a husband, father, and colleague whose only mistake had been showing up to work that morning. Reports differ on the exact number of shots fired. Some say 3, others 4, but the outcome was tragically clear. A respected city manager was dead, and the man who pulled the trigger traded his freedom for decades behind bars. Today, the memory of that December morning still lingers inside Houston's Solid Waste Management Department. A memorial page on the city's website honors Michael Vaughn's service and the life he lost in an instant of workplace violence that left an entire department shaken. Number 19, Jennifer San Marco. She had once worn the uniform of the United States Postal Service, sorting mail inside a quiet processing plant on the outskirts of Goleta, California. But on the night of January 30th, 2006, Jennifer San Marco, 44 years old, returned not as an employee, but as the figure at the center of one of the deadliest workplace shootings in postal history. San Marco had struggled for years with erratic behavior and paranoia, issues that had already led to her medical retirement from the Goleta mail processing facility. Co-workers remembered strange outbursts, incoherent muttering, and an obsession with being persecuted by fellow employees. In 2003, deputies had even escorted her from the plant after an episode that required a brief psychiatric hold. After leaving California for a short period in New Mexico, she came back to Santa Barbara County in late 2005, living quietly in a small apartment complex. But beneath the surface, something was building. That Monday evening began in silence on a residential street in Santa Barbara. Around 8 p.m., neighbors later heard a sharp crack echo through the complex. Inside a condo, San Marco's former neighbor, Beverly Graham, 54, lay dead from a gunshot wound. It would take investigators several hours to link that first killing to what was about to unfold miles away. Shortly after 9 p.m., San Marco drove to the Goleta Mail Processing and Distribution Center, where she had once worked. The sprawling complex, hemmed in by fencing and security gates, was active with night shift employees. She pulled up to the gate and tailgated another car through the entry before guards could react. Carrying a 9mm Smith & Wesson semi-automatic pistol, she crossed the employee parking lot. In the darkness outside the building, she encountered 3 postal workers heading in or out of the facility. Without warning, she opened fire. Z. Fairchild, 37, was shot in the head. Malaika Higgins, 28, was struck next, collapsing near her car. Nicola Grant, 42, was killed moments later. San Marco moved methodically, reloading as she advanced toward the building's side entrance. Near the doorway, she confronted an employee and forced them at gunpoint to surrender their security badge. With the badge in hand, she entered the building, an area she knew well from her years inside. Loud sorting machines filled the air with a mechanical roar, masking the sound of her approach. Just inside the lobby, she encountered Charlotte Colton, 44, a supervisor and training coordinator who had once overseen her work. San Marco raised the weapon and fired, striking Colton in the head. Colton was rushed to the hospital but died 2 days later from her injuries. Moving deeper into the plant, San Marco shot Guadalupe Swartz, 52, multiple times near her workstation, then turned the gun on Dexter Shannon, 57, who was struck and killed instantly. When her rampage was over, 6 postal employees lay dead or dying inside and outside the building. San Marco then placed the pistol to her head and took her own life. When Santa Barbara County Sheriff's deputies arrived minutes later, they found a scene of confusion and terror. The constant clatter of machinery had concealed the attack until it was too late. Inside, emergency lights flickered over fallen bodies and scattered mail. Officers secured the scene and recovered San Marco's handgun and spare ammunition. By early morning, they learned of Beverly Graham's death at her nearby apartment, linking the 2 incidents into a single timeline of violence. Investigators searching San Marco's home discovered writings filled with paranoid statements and rambling accusations that former colleagues had conspired against her. They concluded that the attack stemmed from long-standing delusions and resentment tied to her past employment. Officials avoided labeling the motive as purely revenge or mental collapse, acknowledging that her deteriorating psychological state defied simple explanation. In total, 7 people were killed, 6 postal workers at the Goleta plant and 1 neighbor in Santa Barbara. Among them was Charlotte Colton, the supervisor whose professionalism and compassion had once helped guide employees through their shifts. Now remembered as a victim of the same workplace she had devoted her career to improving. The Goleta massacre stunned the nation and prompted renewed scrutiny of mental health intervention and workplace safety procedures. For many inside the Postal Service, it revived painful memories of earlier, going postal tragedies from the 1980s and 90s. In the end, investigators closed the file with no surviving suspect and no single motive, only the haunting record of a woman whose untreated instability erupted into unimaginable violence. Number 20. Mark Anthony Leon. He was just 22 years old when he walked into work that evening, carrying more anger than anyone around him realized. Mark Anthony Leon had been on the schedule at a Wingstop restaurant in Irving, Texas, a small franchise tucked off East Irving Boulevard, where regulars came for quick takeout and the smell of fryer oil hung in the air. For most of the staff, it was just another Monday shift. For Leon, it would end in bloodshed. Inside the restaurant that night, the team moved through the usual rhythm of orders and cleaning stations. Christopher Martin Govea, only 19, had recently been promoted to manager. Friends said he was easygoing, proud of his job, and always the first to help cover a shift. That evening, as closing duties began, Govea reportedly told Leon he could head home early. It was a small instruction, routine for anyone working under a manager, but to Leon, it seemed to trigger something volatile. According to the arrest affidavit later obtained by reporters, Leon reacted with sudden fury. In a moment that stunned everyone present, he reached toward his waistband, pulled out a handgun, and opened fire inside the restaurant. The first shots struck Govea multiple times, knocking him to the floor. A second employee standing nearby tried to take cover, but was grazed in the head and leg by stray bullets. Customers outside heard the noise and began calling 911. The entire confrontation lasted seconds. Leon fled on foot through the parking lot, leaving behind chaos, shattered glass, and a 19-year-old manager dying where he fell. Responding officers from the Irving Police Department arrived within minutes. They found Christopher Govea unresponsive and pronounced him dead at the scene. Paramedics treated the injured co-worker, later identified by one outlet as Jesus Mendez, for grazing wounds that were not life-threatening. Witnesses provided a description of the suspect and the direction he ran. Patrol units quickly surrounded nearby blocks, searching alleys and side streets. Within roughly 10 minutes, officers spotted Leon a short distance from the restaurant. He was taken into custody without further violence, and police recovered the handgun believed to be the murder weapon. At the station, investigators pieced together what had happened inside the restaurant. They confirmed that the argument began when Govea told Leon to clock out and go home early, a directive that should have ended the night uneventfully. Instead, it became the spark for an impulsive act of workplace rage. There was no robbery, no long-term plot, just a moment of uncontrolled anger that ended one young man's life and shattered another's future. By the following morning, local news outlets identified the victim. Christopher Govea's family described him as hard-working, juggling 2 jobs to support his parents, and proud of his promotion to manager at such a young age. At the same time, police confirmed Leon's full name, Mark Anthony Leon, and announced that he faced murder and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon charges. Court records show that Leon's bond was set at $1,100,000, and he was transferred to the Dallas County Jail. Prosecutors detailed the sequence in their filings: a dispute over leaving work, a gun drawn from the waistband, multiple shots fired in the confined space of a restaurant kitchen. Reporters who visited the Wingstop later described flowers and candles placed near the door, a quiet memorial for a young manager killed while simply doing his job. The company offered condolences, and the community gathered for a vigil in Govea's memory. As of the latest public record, Leon remains charged but not yet convicted. His case stands as another tragic example of workplace violence, a moment of rage that erased 2 futures in one instant. Workplace stress can push anyone to the edge, but losing control can end lives in seconds. These cases remind us that self-control and tolerance aren't optional, they're survival skills. If you ever feel overwhelmed or angry, step back and talk to someone, a counselor, a coworker, or a mental health professional. Getting help is a sign of strength, not weakness. If you've been watching the channel and haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Stay safe until next time.